Hi, I'm going to present a simple argument against a popular view about how to handle overdetermined harms. I have presented this argument in different versions in some places, but apparently many haven't been convinced, so I'll give it a try again. So consider this case. I just had this paper rejected by the Journal of Overdetermination. According to that journal's strict policy, manuscripts are rejected when one of the two reviewers suggests so, regardless of what the other reviewer says. In this case, both reviewers wanted the paper rejected. The simple comparative counterfactual analysis of harm says that an event E harms A if and only if A would have been better off had E not occurred. I would have been better off if this paper had not been rejected. I seem to be harmed, and the two reviewers appear to bear some responsibility for this. However, assuming that the comforting effect of one positive review would have been outbalanced by the frustration created by being rejected in spite of such a review, I would not have been better off if just one of the reviewers had liked the paper. So on the simple comparative counterfactual conception of harm, no single decision harms me. There is a genre of less mundane stories illustrating overdetermination or preemption challenges to the comparative conception of harm, like X and Y's shooting me, where both shots are lethal from Parfit, or Batman's being hit by a flaming cannonball while having a heart attack from Bradley. These stories appear to undermine the common intuition that motivates the comparative counterfactual account of harm. That is, that harms make a difference in a negative way to the person harmed, as Bradley says. A popular way of meeting this challenge that feels natural and extremely appealing, as Neil Fate says, is to assume that in cases like these we will have to regard the set in Parfit's word, or plurality in Fate's word, of initial events as what harms. In Parfit's terms, reviewers 1 and 2 together harm me. Parfit mostly puts the suggestion in terms of groups and acts, but since we want a principle for dealing with harms that are overdetermined not only by actions but by any kind of events, it's preferable to formulate the principle in terms of events rather than acts. So in Neil Fate's terminology, a plurality of events harms A if and only if that plurality is the smallest plurality of events, such that if none of them had occurred, A would have been better off. I agree that this way of treating overdetermination and preemption cases is intuitively appealing. However, a striking feature of this account that hasn't been sufficiently highlighted is that in the cases construed to challenge the simple comparative counterfactual account of harm, the plurality of events picked out by the analysis makes no difference to the worse for anyone. What features are required for these cases to create problems for the simple counterfactual account of harm? In a real-life case, the most obvious counterfactual assumption we would make is probably that if they had not both rejected, then either only one of them would have done so, or none of them had done so. So if they had not both rejected, the paper might have been accepted. If we apply the simple counterfactual conditional account in these circumstances, we would be allowed to say that R1's act or R2's act, or the plurality consisting in both their acts, might have harmed me. But this would merely reflect our epistemic position, and the case would not be very helpful when it comes to understanding under what conditions an event actually harms. The cases under consideration are construed to help us examine conditions for objective harming. They are challenges to the simple counterfactual conditional account, because that account appears to fail to give a plausible verdict in a fully specified case where it's true by stipulation that if R1 would have rejected the paper even if R2 had accepted, and that R2 would have rejected the paper even if R1 had accepted. These are the two conditionals that make it false to say that either R1 or R2 harms me on the simple counterfactual conditional account of harming. From 1 and 2 it follows that if R1 and R2 had not both rejected the paper, one of them would still have done so. So in Lewisian terms, 1 is true if and only if some world in which R1 rejects but R2 does not is closer to our world than any world in which neither rejects. And 2 is true if and only if some world in which R2 rejects but R1 does not is closer to our world than any world in which neither rejects. So in other words, given these essential features of the initial case description, if the plurality of events consisting in the acts of R1 and R2 had not occurred, one of the elements in that plurality would still have occurred, and my paper would still have been rejected. If we think that the single events are harmless in the overdetermination cases under consideration because they make no difference to the words for anyone, we should then conclude that the pluralities are harmless for the same reason. If, on the other hand, we want to hold on to the view that a plurality of events harms A if and only if that plurality is the smallest plurality of events, such that if none of them had occurred, A would have been better off, we will have to give up the view that making a difference to the worse for someone is essential to harming. That would be to abandon the strong intuition that motivated the counterfactual comparative account, and it would mean that there is no challenge from overdetermination and preemption to begin with. So, why is this plural harm principle intuitively plausible? According to a standard way of thinking, when we consider what would have happened had not some actual event happened, the relevant counterfactual comparison is the possible world absent the actual event in question, which is closer to the actual world than any other possible world. A natural way of thinking might be to assume that the world without a certain plurality of events, which is closest to the world where that plurality occurs, is one where another plurality of events occurs, which is minimally different from the actual plurality. If the actual plurality consists of more than one event, one might then think that the closest world is one with a plurality consisting in all but one of the members in the actual plurality. This would be consistent with what has been said so far about the plural harm principle as applied to the overdetermination cases under consideration. Admittedly, the question of how to precisify the vague notion of closest world has no given answer, and on most views this is a purely contextual matter. Michael McDermott makes the following observation. He says, consider two unrelated events, E1 and E2. Then sentence 1 seems to be true on its most natural interpretation, and sentence 2 seems to be false. Sentence 1, if E1 had not occurred, E2 would still have occurred. 2, if they had not both occurred, 1 would still have occurred. Contrary to sentence 2, he says, we think that if they had not both occurred, that might have been because neither occurred. Intuitively, McDermott's observation seems plausible, at least if one tries hard to disregard the first sentence when considering the second, and vice versa. What would have happened if one of the two events had not occurred, and what would have happened if both events had not occurred, are questions that we typically ask in different types of contexts. Typically, but not necessarily, the second question invites us to compare with a world where neither of the two events occur. In a similar manner, what would have happened if this plurality of events had not occurred? It may invite us to compare with a world where none of the events in that plurality occurs. I suggest that one possible explanation of why we find the plural harm principle intuitively attractive is that the formulation of the principle invites us to switch from thinking about the essential features of the original case to thinking of a case where the relevant comparison is a world where none of the elements in the plurality occurs. If we read the principle in that way, it's no longer applicable to the cases that it was supposed to handle. An essential feature of those cases is that if any of the two events had not occurred, the other event would still have occurred, which implies that if the plurality had not occurred, one of its elements would still have occurred. So when we ask what would have happened if the plurality of R1's and R2's acts had not occurred, the context and hence the relevant counterfactual comparison is given by the case description. There is no room for contextual variation in this respect between our reading of the description of the case and our reading of the principle when applied to that very case. In many real-life cases, pluralities of events fulfilling the plural harm principle do make a difference to the worse for someone. If we think of a murder committed by two accomplices, it is often reasonable to assume that if both had not acted the way they did, none of them had. We may think of the events in the plurality as codependent. Some of Fate's and Parfit's characterizations of the plural harm principle invites that kind of reading of the principle. They both think that it is plausible to say that in cases like the ones under consideration, the two perpetrators together harm me. The term together carries with it a flavor of togetherness, collectivity, intentional coordination, planning, we-thinking, interdependence, etc. And when we are tempted to think in such terms of what would have happened if R1 and R2 had not rejected, or if A and B had not shot me, X and Y had not shot me, our intuitions may be misled. In the cases that the principle is supposed to handle or resolve, the relevant events are not codependent. The plural harm principle, that approach involves a shift from referring to the relevant events in plural to referring to them with a noun in singular. They harmed me, with a plural verb form and without further context, is ambiguous between a collective and a distributive reading. It could mean that each did something to me, which is a natural reading when we think of the two independent events like the rejection suggestions or the two shootings in Parfit's example. It could also mean that the collection did something to me, which makes it natural to think of the events as codependent, or of each event as a necessary contribution to what happens to me. The singular verb form in a plurality harms me points to a collective reading, regardless of which noun we prefer, group, set, whole, plurality, composite event. This kind of rephrasing tends to favor the collective reading. As long as we don't try to disambiguate between the distributive and the collective reading, we may be able to hold on to the intuition that there must be some sense in which they harm me in the rejection case. However, the interpretation that each harms me is incompatible with a counterfactual comparative analysis of harm. The interpretation that the collective harms me suggests that the events are codependent, or that each event is necessary and together they are sufficient for my being harmed. Both features are incompatible with the overdetermination case under consideration. So a second tentative diagnosis of our being attracted by the plural harm account is that the formulations of the principle invites us to think of the cases in more strongly collective terms than the initial case descriptions allow. Fate's explication of the term plurality strengthens this suspicion. On the one hand, he says that quote, a plurality of events harms Batman is just a way of saying that they harm Batman, which is open between the distributive and the collective reading. On the other hand, he says that the idea about plurality, quote, is simply that some basic facts about harm are irreducibly plural in the same way that the fact that, say, Alan and Beth and Carol and Don carried the boat might be irreducibly plural. But unlike Batman's heart attack and the flaming cannonball, 4 persons carrying a boat together appears to be a paradigm case of a collective activity, where typically each contribution makes a difference, coordination is required, etc. A third feature of the analysis of harm, of plural harm, that may mislead us to think of the pluralities in question as making a difference to the worse for someone is the necessary move to avoid including superfluous events in the plurality that harms, the restriction to the smallest plurality of events, such that if none of them had occurred, A would not have been worse off. This is a restriction to the smallest actual plurality of events, such that if none of them had occurred, A would have been better off. This may be conflated with the smallest possible plurality of events, such that if none of them had occurred, A would have been better off. That is, the plurality that would be sufficient and necessary for A's being worse off than A would have been if the plurality had not occurred. But in the cases under consideration, the plurality is not necessary for A's being worse off in that sense, since any of its elements would suffice. So, I suggest that we hold on to the counterfactual comparative analysis of harm and consequently abandon the plural harm principle. Then we should conclude that neither Y shooting me, X shooting me, or the plurality of events consisting in their shooting me harms anyone. Our conclusions should be similar with respect to the 2 rejections and Batman's 2 simultaneous causes of death. The consequences of taking this position are much less radical, I think, than they might seem. Accepting the implications of the counterfactual comparative analysis of harm is quite compatible with holding on to the part of Parfit's view which says that it can be morally wrong to perform an act when it belongs to the smallest plurality of acts, such that if none of the acts had been performed, some person would not have been worse off. We could also claim that performing such an act can make the agent co-responsible for making the person worse off. Similarly, we could still say that an event can be bad if it belongs to the smallest plurality of events, such that if none of the events had occurred, some person would not have been worse off. Then, of course, we need an explanation of what makes the act wrong or the event bad, which doesn't appeal to the view that the act, event, or event harms someone, or to the view that the act or event belongs to a plurality of events that harm someone. Moreover, we need an account of co-responsibility or complicity for an event, which doesn't require that the co-responsible agent has made a difference to the occurrence of that event. But these issues should be separated from the conceptual analysis of harm, and they are, strictly speaking, beyond the scope of this paper. I have some ideas about how to approach them, but I will not bring that up here. Thank you very much for listening. Look forward to questions and comments.